This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic Happy Hour, whose tagline is burning questions, not people. You know, we've been around for a long time now, and we've had many different lineups, and Heretic Happy Hour is only getting bigger and better with guest hosts like Rainn Wilson, David Bentley Hart, John Fugelsang, Candida Moss, Elaine Pagels, and of course, December Rose. 2024 and 2025 are turning out to be our best years yet. So check us out on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's Heretic Happy Hour. We hope to see you soon.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat. I'm with my brother John and our lovely cohort, companion, colleague, co-conspirator, Bethany. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
Say, what up, Bethany?
What up? I was going to say, so the day that you weren't there, Nat, you were like out of town. And so I had to like step in as like the main host. My brother listened to that podcast and he called me afterwards. He's like, you know, when that scene in Wayne's World, when the corporation takes over and they like change the name, like it's Wayne's World. He's like, you sounded just like that. I'm like, dang it.
I'm your host, Wayne. And this is just going to do the voiceover thing. Yeah,
Totally.
It's a little bit, it's weird. I don't know. I always get like way up inside my head when I do this, and I don't know why. It just is what it is. And then I always anticipate saying something different, and I probably 90% of the time say the same thing, don't I, John?
I guess.
It's just like, or I break the fourth wall and make some silly crack about something. Anyway, this is the podcast, by the way. We're a minute and 33 seconds, and I haven't even told you. Although I keep saying this because I assume that if you click the button or you've clicked the link, me telling you what the podcast is just affirms you made the right choice, I guess. Like you didn't just get like suckered into clicking on some like right-wing fundamentalist program, which April 1st is coming around. We should probably do something like that, John.
That'd be hilarious.
But this is the podcast, man. We call it This Is Not Church because if it was church, you would have left by now, and we'd be right there with you. I think we'd probably follow you out the door. Bethany's nicer; she'd probably stick around and probably help clean up afterwards. But,
that tracks. That tracks.
we do ask, though, if you are going to leave, that you don't leave before we have a chance to pass the offering plate and you sow into our ministry, and we can guarantee you what are we up to, 1,000-fold return?
I think we're 1,000-fold, yeah.
I think we need to bump it. You know,
we're bumping
the economy's the economy's in the shitter, man. We got to go like maybe 1,500 times.
Okay, 1,500 times. Okay.
So into the ministry, and we'll see what we can do for you. Anyway, we are here as always with an awesome guest. We have with us today. We have Heather Matthews. She's a Doctor of Ministry Program Manager at Wheaton College Graduate School. She's worked as a pastor, a church planter, a nonprofit leader, and a missionary. And she has a new book out called Confronting Sexism in the Church: How We Got Here and What We Can Do About It. Welcome to the podcast, Heather. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you all.
Well, we're so glad that you're here. You guys were chatting offline, and I came in sort of mid-conversation. How's things in the Chicago part of the world? Is it hot in Chicago right now?
It is very hot here. Occasionally we get a good day, but the summers here are pretty hot. And I think global warming has definitely come to Chicago also.
Yikes. Because your winters are brutal too. I mean, good Lord, you got both extremes.
Yeah, but honestly, I think the winters have gotten milder since I've lived in the Midwest, so I can't complain. It hasn't been too bad.
Climate change is real, man.
Yeah.
Climate change is real. So I don't know. I've only been to Chicago twice, and I like it. It's fun. It's a fun place to visit. They have good pizza. I do really enjoy Chicago pizza.
Yeah, good pizza here.
I did enjoy watching a terrible baseball game at Comiskey Park. That was the Cubs were out of town, so I couldn't go see the Cubbies. Had to go see the White Sox. That was not great. But unless you're a White Sox fan, in which case I apologize.
I'm not. I don't even care.
It's like, I'm here to talk about like serious things, and this guy's talking about baseball. So fine. Hey, our one of our standard questions we like to just sort of kick things off with is to ask people about maybe their spiritual background, a little bit about their journey. If you don't mind kind of filling in some blanks for us, that would be awesome. We'd appreciate it.
Sure. I grew up in the Nashville, Tennessee area, so surrounded in the Bible Belt. And I grew up going to a Southern Baptist church from the time I was really small. So I grew up in this large Southern Baptist church through high school until I graduated, and then left home then and moved up here to the Midwest. So that's really what my growing up years were like. I had a great church, a great experience, great youth group that I was part of, but probably like a lot of people, as I became an adult and had more experiences, some of my ideas about faith changed, and I haven't been part of the Southern Baptist Church since then. But, some of that experience definitely goes into, is part of the book that I just wrote about sexism.
Yeah, I would imagine. So was there a particular maybe domino that fell for you that made you kind of, was it a deliberate thing to exit the church, or did you find yourself sort of gradually kind of moving away from that?
Just leaving for college, and moving to the Midwest, in the South, Southern Baptist churches are everywhere. And at least when I went away to college, it wasn't the case. So I was part of a campus ministry and some different types of churches, and ended up landing in a non-denominational church eventually. So that's kind of how it unfolded. It wasn't intentional at first, but eventually I've been a part of a number of different churches, and my theological viewpoints have changed. But yeah, that's where it started for me.
So I was curious. So you kind of wrote a bit about your upbringing in your book, Confronting Sexism in the Church, which is excellent. And I'm wondering if there was there a catalyst that kind of started you wanting to pursue what this looked like and to write about it? And what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, the point where I really started thinking about this issue was when I went to seminary right after college. And that's I didn't mention that when I was talking about when I was growing up, but I did feel called into ministry as a teenager. So I was really thinking from a pretty early age that that's what I wanted to do with my life. And so right after college, I went to seminary and didn't know a whole lot about what I was getting into at the time. I went to a highly academic top 10 university. I went to Northwestern University here in the Chicago area. And going from there straight to Evangelical Conservative Seminary was confusing and disorienting, to say the least. And I got there and I realized that there are people that don't believe that women should be in leadership or in ministry in the church, that there were people who didn't treat women very well, people who wouldn't look me in the eye, people who didn't support what I was trying to do with my life. And it was really overwhelming, and I cried a lot, and I couldn't figure out what I was doing. And I felt completely lost and unsure of how to move forward. So that was really the turning point for me, where I realized that something wrong was happening in the way that the evangelical church saw and treated women. And that's when I really started digging into the issue for myself and reading and learning. And then it went on from there. And eventually, when back in 2018, I started a doctor of ministry degree. And this is part of what I did my research on for that degree. I researched women who were female pastors in evangelical churches. And so this book is loosely tied into that research that I did at the time.
Was it hard to find very many women pastors in the evangelical church? I know there's a lot of mainline female pastors. Was it challenging in any way?
Not exactly. I was living in Wisconsin at the time and was part of a network of churches that had women in leadership in the church. Most of the senior pastors were still men, but there were a number of female pastors in a lot of churches that I was connected to, which is pretty common. And that's part of what I talk about. I was looking at in my doctoral research is there's actually quite a number of churches that will allow women to be pastors, but there's still a limit to what women can do in the church. And they're still expected to submit to male authority in a number of ways. And there's still sexism under the surface and throughout the organizations and churches. So that's a big part of the issue, is that women are allowed to do some things, but just not all things. So I had a lot of great people to talk to who I was able to interview about these things.
I have so many questions for you. I just oh my gosh, they just keep coming up. So if anybody else needs to jump in, you're welcome to. The thing that I'm curious about is when you talked to these women, I'm curious if they negated their experiences or if they tried to make them seem like they were less than they were. For instance, I'm also a pastor, one of the lead pastors at a church, and this big guy would come up to me every Sunday and give me a hug, and I'm okay with hugging people. But this one Sunday, he hugged me and he picked me up and twirled me around. And I was like, oh my gosh, you would never do this to a male pastor. Like, I feel so uncomfortable, but at the same time, I just felt like I had to laugh it off because I felt awkward. And then I was thinking, is this sexism? Is this, I don't know what it was, but it made me uncomfortable enough that I felt like I needed to say something, and I eventually did. But yeah, that question of when you asked women, were they generally trying to negate their experiences, or were they honest about them?
They were honest about them when I talked to them, but I think what you're saying is exactly what happens on a regular basis. Is usually we don't have people asking us questions about these experiences. We don't have an opportunity to talk about them or to share them with other people. So I think that's what all of us who are women in leadership and ministry do almost every day. We have these interactions and experiences, and we don't have any option except just to ignore them and move on or laugh them off. But they're real and they happen every single day to women, little things like that. But they add up and they impact the work that we do and the way that we see ourselves and our confidence as leaders. And so I think most women that I talk to were so happy to be able to talk about these experiences and feel like they were legitimate, and to be able to give voice to these experiences that they have had that they've really not been able to talk about before, and be heard and have them impact, the cultures that they're working in. So I think that's what happens all the time to most women.
Yeah, thanks. What about you guys? Yeah, go ahead.
John and I grew up at least partially grew up in a denomination that was somewhat open to females in leadership. I mean, I had a youth pastor that was a woman. And typically, this was Foursquare. I don't mind saying Foursquare. So John and I spent a lot of time in Foursquare church growing up. And I was on staff at a Foursquare church for a couple different ones. But anyway, I don't recall, and this is a small slice of my little pie. All right. So I can't say this is true of Foursquare, although it seems true of the denomination, that they were fine with calling women pastors as long as they weren't the pastor. So husbands and wives who would almost always co-pastor. So if you're on staff at a Foursquare church and you're married, it's probably pastors, so and so and so and so. And she was absolutely would preach from the pulpit from time to time, certainly there to do certain leadership things. But I'd never ran across an instance where there was a woman who was the senior pastor, and then her husband was like the first husband of the church. There was still a hierarchy, even in those places that were at least indicating that they were more inclusive. Do you find that to be the case in something like that? Is there like a gradient of acceptance where we go, Southern Baptist is hell no, and then we kind of slide up till we get to maybe the Episcopal Church, which is like, come one, come all?
Yeah, exactly. I think that what you experience is pretty common in a lot of evangelical churches that they allow women in some leadership positions, just not all leadership positions. There's still this ceiling, and especially that senior pastor role is usually reserved for men. Most of the time, men will be the one preaching, except maybe in circumstances like you're talking about. Sometimes there's a husband and wife that will co-pastor together, but often it's still the man that has more authority in leadership. So yeah, I think there's probably a few churches out there now that have women as senior pastors, but they're very few. It's mostly in mainline denominations where that's more supported and seen as normal. It's very rare in evangelical churches.
It was quite a shock to my fundamentalist self, or my fundagelical, whatever you want to call me. I was firmly in that camp for a long time, and I participated in a spiritual retreat called the Walk to Emmaus, which I know Bethany's familiar with because it's ostensibly a Methodist thing, although it's very ecumenical. And so for me to show up at this place and be, I went on a walk, and then I participated as clergy for years and years, and like to sit at the table with all the other clergy, and it was like there was women there. It was like whoa. Like,
feels a little different.
Like, hold up. Like, I don't know what y'all are doing over here. But that was actually, it was one of those things that I had to confront, you know, and I had to figure out how much of this was my bias because that's just the way I was raised, how much of it was bias because of just the churches that I attended, and how much of I just needed to learn, you know. But yeah, it set me for a loop, and I went back to my very, very fundamentalist church and had words. The pastor's like, listen, bro, I don't know if you know what's going on out there, but man, they're letting women preach. It's like, I know, we just have to deal with it or something, you know. But anyway, but it's a strange thing. I mean, and then I see that a lot. And so the Methodist Church is the one that I'm the most familiar with. And maybe Bethany can answer this question. I still see some remnants of sexism, even in churches like the Methodist Church, where they do fully affirm and ordain women. Has this been your experience, Bethany? All the women pastors I know that are Methodists, and there's a bunch of them that I know, almost always pastor small churches. And they pastor more than one church.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, actually. Wow.
I can't remember the last time I saw a female pastor in one of the two giant Methodist churches in my town or any other. It's usually, those are men.
Yeah.
And then, but women, I feel like, again, my slice of the world. I know several though. Man, they're working those women hard.
Yeah.
I mean, they're considered part-time, although they pastor two small churches.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. I think a lot of times it depends on the conference within the Methodist Church. So obviously Texas is way more conservative than California. And we do have a number of female bishops. So they're the ones that are in charge of all the other pastors in their conference area. So it just depends. It seems like what you've observed is consistent even in California until the last few years. I feel like in the last few years, there's been maybe a little bit more women being moved into bigger churches with a greater amount of congregants, or ones that are more prestigious historically. But even then, it's fairly rare. However, what I've noticed in the United Methodist Church, and I also pastor a non-denominational church that's not associated with anything except Jesus, I guess.
And even that's kind of loose. I'm just kidding. Very loose affiliation.
Yeah, there's definitely differences with wherever somebody is, for sure.
So I guess what I'm getting at is, and I want to, this is the question that I would have for Heather then, just because there are spaces where it seems like women have a larger role or they're more included, doesn't seem like, I mean, it just seems like there's still a lot of work to be done. You haven't found a place yet that's like free of sexism or free of patriarchy or hierarchy. Has that been your experience? I mean, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but that's what it seems.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, this is all a work in progress. Maybe since most recently since the 70s, we've seen more women getting ordained in different denominations and moving into positions of leadership and some of those higher positions that you're talking about, like bishops. But it's still slow progress. And there's been maybe a little bit of progress in the last, since the turn of the century. But it's, that's the whole issue, is that women still, you don't see equity across the board for women in leadership and these types of positions and in churches and different denominations. Some denominations have made more progress than others, like the United Methodist Church. But most churches, what I found is that even churches, like what you're saying, is most churches that allow women in leadership, there's still many fewer in number. There's still almost always more men in the higher level positions in bigger churches and more women in the lower level positions in smaller churches and non-pastoral roles. So you're exactly right. That is the way things are. And I think there is momentum for change. I think we are seeing change, but it has been slow. And that's the way, that's how you know that there is sexism still there, is that there's a lot of resistance in a lot of churches and denominations to moving more women into leadership. Women aren't naturally identified as leaders or given these opportunities. And there's, so many different kinds of underlying implicit unconscious sexism, kind of like what we were just talking about, where Bethany was spun around in the air by someone in her church. Right. There's so many little things like men talking over women in meetings, or things like that happen every day and nobody notices. And yet that's part of the way sexism works. And it's, some people think it's more common in evangelical spaces because we've supported this type of behavior and male leadership throughout the history of the church.
I think what I'm seeing, and I have done no research on this is just an observation, is there are way less pastors coming in than are retiring. And so there's this deep need for pastors, and traditionally pastors have been male in most of the denominations. And so it's almost like women are, at least in the United Methodist Church, women are getting more powerful spaces in the churches because there is less men to fill that role at this point. And it reminds me of like the excuse that the church that I grew up in and many other churches have used about like Deborah in the Old Testament. Well, she just filled in because there wasn't a man able to do it or willing to do it. Or Mary Magdalene being the one to pronounce the gospel. Well, she just did that because Peter had left. If Peter was there, Jesus would have used Peter. Almost like women are there just in like the sidelines to fill in when all the good men are gone. And when we think of this, of scripture in the form of a progressive guidebook, essentially, like that all of scripture based on when it was written and the time it was written was incredibly progressive for the time it was written in, then I think we're meant to always look at it as something that is progressing us forward into greater inclusivity and shared leadership and shared voices. And I love how, Heather, you mentioned Romans 16 in part of your book about like how Paul ends the book of Romans, or this letter to the Church of Rome, mentioning so many women leaders, that he was just like admiring them and praising them. And Scott McKnight, he wrote the foreword to your book, but he wrote this book called Reading Romans Backwards, which is phenomenal. And I love how he writes how all of Romans should be read from the voice of Phoebe, because she's the one that would have carried this letter to those churches, to take on the role of Paul to these churches, to embody Paul in her female body. And he empowered her to do that, not as as a last resort substitute, because he could have picked Silas or anybody else, but as the right person for the job. Anyway, I just think your book is needed more than ever right now with if we're seeing more women fill these roles, we need to have more people in support of it instead of having these little microaggression sexisms coming at them.
I'm not sure how micro picking you up and twirling you around.
Yeah, really.
Thank
it
you.
seems like a bit of a macro, a little macroaggression.
A little macro.
I'm sorry. You said I still can't get the image out of my head. I can't imagine like the audacity, the sheer gall of like, oh, aren't you cute? We pick you up. It's very infantilizing too. It's not just sexist. It's like, oh, let me pat you on the head and twirl you around the. Oh, show me your pretty dress.
Totally.
It's like, holy and I bet you money. Now, I know this isn't the topic of the conversation, but I have to ask: when you did bring this up with this person, did he own it, or was there like a lot of?
Very embarrassed, very uncomfortable. I don't know if he necessarily owned it, because also I hate conflict as well. I avoid it at all costs. As an Enneagram 9, that is like the thing I never want to do. So it was I wasn't great at like, hey, let's have a conversation about this. I was just like, hey, this isn't always appropriate. So next time, let's just not do that.
You should write a book on confrontation. The title should be like, listen here, motherfucker. Teaching women to confront asshole men. But let me ask you this, Heather and John. I know I haven't heard from you yet, so I don't want to crowd you out, but we keep it like these things keep popping in my head. One of the things that I've talked about was we've had several guests on to talk about, say, LGBTQ inclusion, right? And one of the things that we've talked about many times is how sometimes, even though, say, the Southern Baptist Church is more intolerant and more, a lot of people consider those safer spaces. for at least you know where you stand. Like you don't go into those spaces because it is unsafe versus these churches that try to ride this sort of middle ground where they make it seem like you're safe and they sort of seem to be inclusive and open. And yet all the while there are sand traps and there are things waiting for you. It seems to me there's a parallel there. There could be a parallel there with women who might enter space that presents itself that way and then find out there's a lot of hidden little traps and snares that are waiting for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think that happens to so many women in ministry. They get jobs in churches with the hopes that they'll be able to grow in leadership and move into bigger positions of authority or leadership. And then they realize that they're not allowed or there's a ceiling to their leadership. And then it's a really difficult position for women to be in. And I think this happens all the time. I know a number of women that you get into a point where you have to decide, do I stay and not do what I feel like I can do or what I should be doing or I'm gifted to do, or do I leave? But leaving is hard too, because then you have to start over, find a new denomination or a new church. So it's a really difficult position, but that happens to so many women. And I know a number of women that have had to leave their churches or their denominations because of that very reason. They were leaders and they felt called into leadership and there just wasn't an opportunity at the churches where they were at.
Well, and so often these churches, and again, I've been a part of a few of them, so I get it. We're not just here throwing rocks, but the truth is, if you're paying lip service to these things and you're giving people the impression that, hey, this is a place where you can grow and you can find and fulfill your potential, whatever that is. And then this happened to me even as just as a man in the church that I worked at. I was constantly being given promises that were never fulfilled. I was never going to be that thing that I so desperately wanted to be in my, and no one would ever come out and say no. It just was the goalpost always moved. Always. Every time I thought, well, if I do this one thing, then the next step for me is this. And then I can't imagine that. For me, it was frustrating. As a woman, I would imagine that has to be devastating and heartbreaking to realize that they might just never let you in the club, but they're not going to be honest enough with you to tell you they're not going to let you in the club. They're just going to sort of work behind the scenes against you. I don't know if that's a true experience or if I'm just projecting my own church hurt out there on other people. Yeah, I think both happens. I think sometimes churches aren't open about it, and some churches are. One of the stories that I share in the book is about a friend of mine who is an incredible leader, but she was at a church and they eventually told her, you will not ever be a pastor here. You won't be a church planter. And it was at that point that she knew she had to leave because she wouldn't be able to continue to do what she felt like she was called to do. I'm trying to wrap my head around churches not sending people out because of genitalia. They're always telling us we're desperate. Like we need people to do this. The harvest is coming and the laborers are few, but let's take half our workforce and say, yeah, well, not so much you though. I mean, we'll save you for the sidelines. You can dig ditches. You can teach Sunday school. I'd be more surprised if they sent the women out to plant churches and when they became successful, send men to take them over. But did you church plant as well? Did I read that in your bio or did I? Yeah, I was a church planter with a group of people out of a bigger non-denominational church that I had been working at. So yeah, I did that. Started a church, was part of starting a church and was there for about 7 years before I moved on to a different role. That's awesome. That's tough work, man. I did it once. Never again. Bethany's still doing it. Did you guys plant your church and you've been there for
18 years.
18
we
years.
planted it 18 years ago. But I didn't start as a pastor because I didn't think that women were allowed to do that. I believed it more than anybody else that women weren't supposed to do that sort of a role. So it took me a while to receive that. I'm kind of curious though, being a pastor, Heather, and serving in a church, compared to being working in a college. Are you a professor? I'm just a staff member. I'm kind of curious, you're at a religious institution. Have you experienced more sexism in one place than the other? Or do you feel kind of protected in a college institution?
I think there's definitely some protections here being in a college because we're here to educate students, men and women. And so there's definitely people with different theological viewpoints here at Wheaton, and probably some students would say that they feel that to some degree. And probably some professors would see a problem with that. But in general, I think it's a pretty equitable place where men and women can come and study and be encouraged in the work that they want to do. It's a little different where I work in the grad school. I work with people who are doing a doctor of ministry, and we have a number of master's degrees for people studying Bible and theology and ministry. And we have more female students coming through our grad school here, which is super than any other place, which is super exciting. And a lot of the female students that I've talked to say that this is the first space that they've been in where they feel that they can be themselves and they're welcome, and there's no one's looking down on them for what they want to do, which just brings a lot of joy to my heart to know that that women here are having a different experience. And a lot of these women are coming from churches where there's still limits on what they can do. But I think at least here in their grad programs, they're having an experience where they feel like they can grow and learn, and it's not impacted by their gender, which is hugely encouraging.
Well, I did have a question, and it's kind of coming from, it's like, as you were writing, you're doing your research that ended up becoming this book. Did you find any pushback from men, or did you have any issues where the women that you were talking to felt maybe even uncomfortable talking because of the biases of men?
Yeah, I would say, most of the people that I talked to were fairly open, at least open to discussing. I think there certainly were, I did anonymous surveys, and then I did interviews with people where they were, they agreed to do the interview with me and talk openly. So there definitely were men that had blind spots, and that was some of what I was looking for. What are the blind spots that men have that are impacting women in their churches and in leadership positions? So that was part of what I was looking for. There was definitely sexism present where men didn't see the problem or didn't see why it was a problem that they hadn't hired any women, so there's definitely some of those things that came out. But generally, people, at least for all the people I talked to, this was on their radar. Most of them were in churches where there were already women in leadership. So, but still, I learned a lot, and there's a lot of work to do even in those spaces.
What does it look like from your experience for men to become allies for women against sexism in the church? We're outside of the church too, but yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so many things that men can do. And I think this is just a huge part of it, is that women need men who will be allies for them. And it's an interesting process trying to figure out how to help men become allies. I think that's a big question, is how do we help more men become allies? I think so often men become allies because they've experienced working with a woman in leadership and it's been good, or they've listened to a woman preaching and have learned something. They say that that's one of the biggest things that changes people's mind about women in leadership, is just simply seeing a woman in leadership who's competent and good at what she does. And I think so many men become better allies through their own relationships with women that they work with, or their wives or daughters or people that they interact with. And those are the types of things. I think sometimes, obviously, maybe they study theology, and that is part of people changing their minds. That certainly can be a piece of it. But so often I think there's a big experiential piece where men work alongside women or under the leadership of women and realize that women in leadership is actually a good thing. It's good for the church. and then they gradually become supportive allies for women. But it's such a huge need, especially, we've already talked about how so many churches still have male leaders. So it's really in the hands of senior pastors and men in leadership who are going to open doors for women. And a lot of women that I talked to said that they would have, if it wasn't for a man that supported them and sponsored them, opened doors for them, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. That was definitely a common theme. So the role of a male ally is just pivotal in addressing these issues in the church.
So what would you do then? Because I think it's all such important work that you've been speaking about. There's always this underlying fear, especially in the evangelical church, about male-female friendship and being in the same room with a single woman if you're a male pastor or whatever it is. Like, what is it? There's all sorts of things about like not driving with somebody alone. All of those like fears, or the idea that women we're scandalous beings just because of our bodies and we're trying to lead people astray or whatever it is. There's so much shame around that we kind of like, I don't know about you, but for me, like growing up in an evangelical background and all of that, there's like so much body shaming that happens, or fear mongering based on our bodies. So I guess, what does it look like for men to be allies in a culture that has protected men from women, like women are wrong?
Yeah, I think this is a huge issue. And one of the topics that came up over and over again when I was talking to women, that this was one of the major barriers for women who want to be leaders in the church or Christian organizations, is this Billy Graham rule that limits how men and women can be together. And it's hugely damaging to women and prevents women from building professional relationships and friendships and keeps them from doing what they want to do. So I think this is a huge thing that needs to be addressed. And I talk about this in the book, that I think men and women can actually have healthy friendships and healthy work relationships, that just because men and women are in a room together doesn't mean that they're automatically going to have sex with each other. I just think this is a huge issue, and we're all missing out on so many good relationships when we limit ourselves to only being able to be friends with or work with people of the same gender. This is part of who the church is. We're men and women serving alongside each other. And there's ways to have healthy relationships with one another. Obviously, we want to be careful and make wise decisions and be faithful to our spouses and not put ourselves in tempting situations. We want to be aware of our own personal temptations, but at the same time, there's ways to have meaningful, healthy relationships between men and women. And I think this is a huge first step in empowering women in leadership, because women just won't be able to move into positions of leadership if they can't have meetings or friendships with men. So I'm a big proponent of dropping these rules and figuring out some common sense ways that we can actually enjoy relationships with each other.
Well, a lot of this seems like it stems from like the purity movement, right? Or purity. And like Nat and I have talked to other guests about the male role in that, right? And so we were brought up with this idea that we shouldn't be around women because apparently we can't control ourselves. And so, well, I mean, we want to be allies, right? And but we have all this like baggage that we have as well.
That's true.
That we're trying to work through. And how can we move past that to help women in these leadership roles, I guess, if that makes sense at all?
Yeah, I think, part of what you're getting at is just that this has been damaging to men and women. And it's, women sometimes are seen as temptresses, but
right.
Men also can't control themselves.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And I think there's more to us as human beings than our sexuality. And we all have to work on our own personal health. And certainly if that's something that anyone needs to work on so that you can have healthy mixed gender relationships, we want to be people of integrity and to be able to have healthy relationships with people of the opposite sex that are our friends. That's just a normal part of life, and certainly something that we would expect of people who are in church leadership, that we would have the ability to have sexual integrity. And so certainly that's something that we all need to be paying attention to. But at the same time, I think it's such an issue that that's all we think of. We've objectified ourselves, we've objectified men, we've objectified women. And so we've boiled down our relationships to this one issue. And there's so much more to being friends and colleagues and community and relationship than this one issue. And so I think part of just being in good relationships will diffuse that to some degree as we get to know each other as whole human beings more than just that one issue.
Well, then on top of that, they, as these issues came up, pastors, mainly men, would sweep under everything under the rug and want to hide it and make sure that no one ever heard about any of this abuse, right?
Well, the thing is, in those places where those rules existed, all that stuff still happened. The rules didn't solve anything. Every church I've ever been a part of that had any sort of scandal that involved some sexual impropriety or other, all had very clear rules about men and women in the same room together, and we weren't supposed to drive in the same car together. We weren't supposed to, there was just this rule after rule. The rules don't solve anything. People like Peter Rollins, would argue that those prohibitions actually make things worse, because prohibition is probably the worst possible way to actually moderate behavior. Because as soon as you tell people they can't do something, well, what the hell do they want to do? And it also perpetuates that myth that men and women cannot coexist without that sexual tension, without that, we're just going to stumble into bed or something. It's never been my experience, John, by the way. Maybe I lack the requisite magnetism, I guess. But does that make sense? So all of these things, they think they're doing the right thing, and maybe in a very, very short-sighted, practical way, perhaps. I would argue even then, no. But in the larger scheme of things, they're actually making all of this much, much worse.
Well, we live in a world that over-sexualizes everything. If I watch a movie on Netflix with a boy and a girl and they're best friends, then part of my brain is rooting for them to hook up at the end. They are going to fall in love. And it's because it's just what we want to see happen. So we assume it's going to happen instead of rooting for a healthy friendship in the end. And so I feel like as the church is meant to be countercultural in many ways. They're meant to be something that the culture desires for themselves and to be able to put that out there. And so how beautiful would it be if the church actually modeled healthy male-female friendships, where there's no weird sexual tension. And then if we were actually honest about the sexual tension, if there was something there as leaders, then we're just honest about it. Hey, I don't think I can actually be in the same room with this person because whatever's happening in me, and I just want to be aware of that. And I want to tell these 3 people about it. And I'm just going to we're just going to do Zoom meetings from now on, or whatever it is that needs to happen, to where there's not shame and secrecy and hiddenness about what people are experiencing, but honesty and grace. And then moving forward, maybe some therapy. I don't know. But I think the church can model a different way forward. And that's my hope. Yeah.
And just to tag onto that, I think there are issues with sexuality. Pornography is a huge issue where we have to pay attention to these things and address them. And like you said, bring them into the light and not shy away from them. And yet at the same time, find ways to still have authentic relationships with one another.
Here's another question. Why do I preface every question with, here's another question. So this book you wrote, it's pretty awesome. Remember that book you wrote? It was awesome. I guess my question is this. I know most of us can recognize the more overt acts of sexism that rear their heads everywhere in the church and out. What might be some examples of some more subtle ways in which that patriarchy or that sexism rears its head in ways that people might not automatically see that way? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I think those are what you're saying is those implicit, unconscious ways that sexism still shows up, even among people like myself or yourselves that don't want to be sexist. They're still there because we have grown up in a sexist culture and a patriarchal culture. So they're just part of our ways of thinking that we're not even aware of sometimes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's some of the things that we've talked about before, like, especially in evangelical churches, this idea of benevolent patriarchy, or with men being the spiritual leader, even in homes or churches where people would believe in equality or women could be leaders, there's still this predominant view that men should be the spiritual leaders of their home. And a lot of people structure their homes around that idea. I think that's a big part of sexism in churches these days. And then there's all the other little things like how men talk more in meetings and interrupt women, or women are more naturally seen as nurturing or have those communal traits, and men are more seen as strong leaders, especially in the church. There's this idea of pastors being, pastors are imagined as strong men. And so that's one of the reasons why it's hard for women to move into pastoral positions or be considered as a pastor or recruited for positions like that, is because they don't fit this stereotype of what a leader is. And that, that's in the broader culture as well. It's changing. These ideas of what a leader is changing, but there's, women who have these stronger leadership qualities oftentimes aren't liked or are labeled with terms that aren't very nice. So there's just so many ways that it comes out in churches and in the culture that you don't notice until you start paying attention or talking to women and learning about their experiences.
Like you kind of were hinting at a little bit, it comes across in language too, right? Like men in these positions are considered strong, outgoing, and again, I'm not going to use the language, charismatic, and then women are troublemakers. I'm not going to use some of the other words that are given, but that is some of this underlying bias, right?
Of course,
that women have to, that we as men need to call out when we see it, when we hear it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the best scenario, when you can notice it and call it out and correct it. Most of the time, it goes unnoticed. Or if a woman points it out, that people are willing to listen and hear and believe the stories that women share, that they did experience some sexism, and then to be willing to change.
Well, and it's a bummer, because it is, Bethany's point's not lost on me. The church is supposed to be countercultural. And I believe that with all my heart, even though I'm not a huge fan of the church these days. And that's a big reason why I'm not a big fan of the church these days, is because they're not counterculture, they're a subculture, and it's different. So rather than offering competing narratives about, hey, this is actually how things could be done, they do the same exact things, because sexism is alive and well in the world. It's not just look at what's happening to Kamala Harris right now, and all the tropes and all the narratives being said about her that we've said about women aspiring to leadership always. She slept her way to the top. She's not very, listen to Trump for 5 seconds and he'll give you every single talking point from every scumbag, misogynist you ever wanted, every drunk uncle you've ever known. And it's
not like they're blaming the men too. Like, they're saying that she slept her way up to the top. Well, she didn't sleep her way up to the top by herself, if that's what the accusation. But it's like the stoning of the woman caught in the act of adultery. I mean, it's always the woman's fault.
The meme that I saw recently was, let's stop saying she slept her way to the top, and let's say he withheld promotions for sexual favors. That's probably not what happened either way, but at least let's couch it in the right terminology. Let's at least say, anyway, you're right, it takes two. But what I'm saying is this: why does the church then come along and mirror these behaviors? It seems like an awful lot of times they're not taking the high road with women. They're not finding ways to advance them. They're just sort of echoing these same sort of things we see in the broader culture. And I'm not sure there's a good answer. Maybe it's just more of a rhetorical question. sort of disguised as a lament. But
I don't know. I mean, I feel like Trump has brought the worst out in our culture with sexism and racism, and in many ways, sometimes I think the church typically can be worse because we have this tradition and theology that sees men often as superior, and so I feel like it's often tolerated more in the church than it typically is in the broader culture, because besides some of what we're seeing now, I think generally there's fairly wide acceptance of women being in positions of leadership. And while it's not 100% equal yet, there's been so much progress in women in different sectors that hasn't necessarily been the case in the church. So in some ways, I think the church is behind. And one of the reasons that people outside the church have a bad taste in their mouth for evangelicalism is because of their treatment of women and other groups.
Well, and they don't have they have the cover of legal protection in their misogyny. I mean, you couldn't get away with most of this stuff in academia. You couldn't get away. I mean, we're way beyond oh my gosh, a lady doctor. At least we've gone beyond like being shocked by that. But the church can operate in 18th, 17th century mindsets. And because of religious freedoms, they get to couch it all as religious freedom and go, yeah, you can't really come and criticize our hiring practices when, this is what our holy book tells us. So how would you even bring a lawsuit against the Southern Baptist Convention for not ordaining women? I don't suspect that you could, although it'd be fun to try. Bethany?
Am I bringing the lawsuit?
Let's make this happen. I want you to, let's just, we'll crowdfund a lawsuit and we'll just go like, hey, she's qualified. What's your deal, man?
Oh, man. Well, and I think that's, so yeah, there's definitely a lot there with, trying to move a very large ship with a tiny little boat. And it's not happening anytime soon, I don't think, for a big institution like the Southern Baptist Convention. But I think sometimes churches try to do that, like within the United Methodist Church. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with this, but they have an appointment system, and every pastor is on an itineracy, meaning that every, 5 to 7, maybe 10 years, they get moved from church to church. So you never stay at a church for very long. And there's positives with that. You're not building a church on a personality. That's awesome. And there's negatives where people don't really get to know each other in the same way, with the pastor being able to be vulnerable. There's strategy in that as well. So sometimes the United Methodist Church will place a female pastor with a church that has never had a female pastor before. And then that woman is then to shift the large boat on her own, which some women are strong and able to do that, and hallelujah for them. And others just aren't, and they get beat down. And same with a person of color or a person who is LGBTQ. That sometimes they'll place a pastor in a space that is hostile in some ways, hoping that there will be a shift because of that appointment. And sometimes it does shift, but oftentimes a lot of people get hurt.
There are a number of denominations doing good work in this that have been intentional about setting policies and theological statements and moving women into positions of leadership in larger churches and overseer roles, bishops. So it's certainly not everywhere yet, but there is some good work being done in some places, and it's encouraging, and hopefully we'll just see it more.
Yeah. One more question. I think we got time for one more, and then we'll probably have to shut it down because we have another one coming up here in a little bit. But the other thing I noticed was this, and I wonder if this is what it might take an organization like, say, the SBC. And I don't hold a lot of hope, but there's a lot of women inside the SBC who are every bit as misogynistic, it seems, who are every bit as patriarchal, and you know what I mean? It's whether it's just the way they were raised or whatever. But I have seen some of the most hurtful, harmful rhetoric coming out of women bashing other women within these denominations as well. What would it take, or would it be possible for a groundswell of women inside of one of these organizations to start to say, like actually you need to start reckoning with us? Would that be enough to move an organization like the SBC, or do you think they're, at least for now, impervious to something like that?
I don't know. They seem fairly well entrenched in this viewpoint. But I do think that you're right. Women are just as committed to gender roles as men are in many circumstances, especially when those gender roles are working for them. They say that many women are happy with the traditional gender roles and that they enjoy their life in that space, and that's fine. But somebody like Beth Moore was in the Southern Baptist Church, and she challenged some of those behaviors and beliefs, and she's not there anymore. And I think that's what, in larger denominations that have these entrenched views, I think that's more the norm, where people who challenge those views end up leaving because it's just not possible to make changes from within.
Well, you go from being, they loved Beth Moore forever and ever until they no longer love Beth Moore. And I'm sure she found herself uninvited from almost everything almost immediately. But I will say this, the amount of good she did before she departed is incalculable. Just for somebody with that much to risk, with that big a platform, to literally put it all on the line for the sake of her integrity, very few people I respect more than her for that. I still don't agree with her on a lot of things, but she put it out there, and she paid a heavy price for having the temerity to suggest that maybe the church could change a little bit. So I appreciate that about her. So maybe we take that as a sign that even though progress is slow, we are slowly but surely moving in the right direction, at least. So maybe by the time our granddaughters are old enough to participate, they can do something. But I have to tell you, it's been great. I really appreciate your insights. Heather, thank you so much for taking the time. When does your book release?
August 27th. It'll be available for purchase.
Very cool. Very cool. I saw there was a pre-order on. I have my copy, but if you've listened this far, we'll probably release this right around release date time. So hopefully you've listened all the way through, and you can run out to your local bookstore, or, if you must, I guess, give Jeff Bezos some of your money. Although local bookstores, man, if you can do it, we're big fans of local bookstores. But we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes, and make sure that people can connect with you in your social media if you have it, and direct them to go buy your book. And we wish you just the best success. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.